I'm Pam Pelagi, and welcome to video 2 of Bible Study Reboot. I hope you got to watch the first video, and if you haven't, please take a few moments to go back and look at that. It's a great video and has a little bit about my journey in Bible study and my journey with the Lord, and also gives you 5 reasons why we study the Bible. Well, in today's video, we're going to look a little bit deeper. We talked in that first video about going beneath the surface, looking for those hidden gems. And today we're going to do that with this video called The Cast of Characters of the New Testament. Well, let me assure you, we have quite a cast of characters. And I know in my own personal Bible reading, so many times as I'm reading the Bible and I open it up, and I just read over certain words and my eyes just skim over them without really understanding some of the deeper levels of maybe who these people were and how they interrelated to each other or what their background was. So today in our cast of characters, we're going to look at several of them just to give you a greater depth when you approach the Bible yourself. Well, we have quite a cast of characters, and some of them are real characters. We're just going to dive right in, and we're going to talk about Herod. Now, you might think there's only one Herod, but there's actually 4 Herods. The first one is Herod the Great, and he's going to come into power right after Julius Caesar conquers Israel. He's going to be named King of the Jews, and he's going to be put into power. Now, Herod the Great is brilliant. He is a brilliant, probably genius level IQ. He is a great builder. He builds Masada, Herodium, so many other. He builds his own palace. His greatest accomplishment is going to be Herod's temple. It took decades to build. He spared no expense, and he built this huge edifice that covered almost a third of all of Jerusalem. It bears the name Herod's Temple because he was the master architect of it. Now, Herod was an interesting character. He was ruthless. He was maniacal, paranoid, and actually quite a murderer. Murdered one of his wives because he suspected her of adultery. Murdered one of his sons, one of the high priests, and he was constantly in a state of turmoil and paranoia, thinking people were going to overthrow him. And so when the Magi come to Herod the Great and say, "The King of the Jews has been born, we want to find him," his reaction is, I don't need another king here. Tell me when you find this King of the Jews so that I can go and worship him too. Well, we know from the Bible record that is not what Herod's going to do. The Magi go home a different way, but Herod sends out an edict to kill all those and slaughter all those babies that are 2 years old or under. So his name is Herod the Great, but actually his actions are not that great. Well, our second Herod is Herod Antipas. It's his son. And Herod Antipas is the Herod of the Passion narratives. He's the one that's going to appear when Jesus is an adult, when John the Baptist is an adult. And so this is the Herod that John's going to confront and say, "You've married your brother's wife, and that's wrong." Unfortunately, this is also the Herod that's going to cause John's head to be cut off. And this is the Herod that Jesus will confront in his Passion narrative. So that's Herod the Great, his son Herod Antipas. Well, there's 2 more Herods, Herod Agrippa I, Herod Agrippa II. And these 2 Herods appear in the book of Acts. Herod Agrippa I is Herod the Great's grandson. And this is the man who stands up and gives this brilliant speech where people say he's like a god. And the angel of the Lord strikes him and he ends up dying. This is also the same Herod who's going to martyr James in Jerusalem. The other Herod, Herod Agrippa II, is the great-grandson of Herod the Great. And this is the Herod who will listen to Paul's testimony when he's imprisoned right before he goes to Rome. So those are our four Herods: Herod the Great, his son Herod Antipas, his grandson Herod Agrippa I, and great-grandson Herod Agrippa II. Our next cast of characters that we're going to take a look at are the Pharisees. Well, we hear a lot about the Pharisees. We read a lot about the Pharisees, and we know that they were in constant butting heads with each other, with Jesus, with the Sadducees. But just exactly who are these Pharisees? Well, they were a political sect and they were a religious sect. And they got started in the 2nd century BC, right about the time of Judas Maccabees and the Maccabean revolt. This was a revolt where they pushed off Syrian oppression and Israel rose once again as its own nation. They became a sect of purists. They were very convinced that their impurity and their disobedience to God had been the cause of the diaspora. In other words, their disobedience and their impure acts and idolatry had caused God to bring judgment upon their nation. So they went to the opposite extreme, to the point where they wanted to make sure every little thing they did, every little thing they said was in exact accordance with what they felt God wanted from them. And that's not a bad thing, except that they took it way too far. There were hundreds and hundreds of laws that they came up with. Jesus even told them, you tithe the herbs, you tithe mint, but you have forgotten the weightier matters of the law. And that's what they were like. They weighed things out, they measured things out, they counted their steps on the Sabbath because they could only go so far before they were considered breaking the Sabbath law. So these were the Pharisees. They were a middle-class group of men who loved God and loved the law, but basically had become very religious in it. Now, they believed in the resurrection, they believed in the Messiah, and they were actually a little more flexible than the next group, the Sadducees. But they were bound up in the religiosity of who they were and how they dressed, how they acted, and even the laws that they tried to keep. And they not only tried to do them themselves, but they tried to impose them on other people. And Jesus condemned them for that. So those are our Pharisees. Now, in direct contrast to the Pharisees, we have another group. Again, a political party and also a religious sect. These are the Sadducees. And I know children in children's church talk about they're sad, you see. Actually, I don't know if they were sad or not, because these guys were the rulers. They were the hierarchy of the Jewish priesthood and over the scope of entire Jerusalem. These were pretty much more the city dwellers. They were descended from the Hasmoneans, who I said before in the Maccabean revolt, where Judas Maccabee had risen up in power. This was when this family came into their dynasty, and the Sadducees were the leftover remnants of that. They were the aristocracy. They were the rich, and they were also had their own brand of belief and their own brand of how they acted. They dominated the political scene and they dominated the religious scene. Now, unlike the Pharisees, these rich men were very much in cahoots at times with the Romans. They were Hellenistic, and that word actually comes from the Greek word Hellenism, which means they embraced Greek thought. They thought that it was okay to mix some of the Judaic ideas with some of the Greek or Roman ideas, and had no problem with those two coming together. And so that's one reason why the Pharisees, on one hand, whose name meant to be apart, were so at odds with the Sadducees, who were more than willing to mix in with their political oppressors. Well, interestingly enough, the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. They were so opposed to that, and this is going to become a point of contention after Jesus rises from the dead. We're going to see it come forth in the book of Acts when the Sadducees and the Pharisees are butting heads with each other, and Paul actually uses this against them when he's giving a defense of his belief system. Our next group in our cast of characters are the Samaritans. Now we know the story about Jesus where he went and he talked to the Samaritan woman. But let's get a little bit deeper background about who were these Samaritans. Jesus also talks about, it gives a parable about the Good Samaritan, which flies in the face of some of his Jewish followers. So, who were these Samaritans? Where did they come from? Well, actually, they were a mixed race. You know, it was very important for the Jews to know their heritage. They believed that they had descended from the 12 tribes. In fact, it was very important for every Jew to understand their own personal lineage. And so we see genealogies listed even in the New Testament and especially in the Old Testament. Well, in 70 AD, when the temple falls, those are no longer going to be recorded. But at this time, they're very, very important, and important to the Jews who are living at the time of Christ. Well, the Samaritans could no longer give their lineage. They had lost it. When the Assyrians came in 722 BC and conquered the 10 northern tribes, what they did was they either annihilated the people or they took a portion of them and brought them to other places in their empire, and then brought people of other nations and brought them into the northern tribes. Then they intermingled, they married, there was no longer a distinction between who was a Jew, who was a Syrian, who was an Arab, who came from other countries. And so the Samaritans were no more a pure race, they were a mixed race. And the Jews turned up their nose at them. Well, what their belief system was kind of a little bit the same way. They were a little mixed in their belief systems. They believed in the first 5 books of the Bible. They believed that Moses was the prophet of God, and they were again looking for the great Messiah. But they didn't worship in the temple. At the time when the 10 tribes seceded from the other 2 tribes and became the nation of Israel, leaving the other 2 tribes to call themselves Judah, when that happened, they erected their own place of worship on Mount Gerizim, and that's where the Samaritans worshiped. So it wasn't even in the same place as the Jews. Even though they had common roots and common belief systems, they weren't identical to them either. And yet, they were important enough for Christ to make a visit up to the Samaritan village, to talk to the Samaritan woman and spend time there to see a whole village saved. So those are our Samaritans, not a pure race of Jews, but a mixed race. But yet something still in the heart of God, in some place that God directed His Son to go. We have one other group of people to mention too. Something that you might read and just kind of skirt right over. They're known as God-fearers. Well, what does that mean? What is a God-fearer? Well, actually, we have a great example of a God-fearer in a man named Cornelius in the book of Acts. Cornelius loved God. He gave offerings to God. He believed in God. But the difference between a Jew and a God-fearer is that the God-fearer didn't follow all of the exact rules that the Jews did. So, for example, they may not have been circumcised. They may not actually do the complete tithing or all of the rules, especially those that the Pharisees had come up with. They had a belief system. They worshiped, they gave, they served, they had a heart of compassion and giving, but they did not follow in all the footsteps and all the rules and regulations that at that time Judaism had set down. So these were Gentile believers. And as I said, our great example here is Cornelius. Now, what does God do with Cornelius? He sends Peter, the apostle. He gives him a vision and sends him to the God-fearer Cornelius so that he and his whole household will be saved. And the gospel formally comes to the Gentiles and begins to spread from that point on. So God chooses a God-fearer. He sees their heart. And in essence, that's all God ever does, is he looks on the heart of man and sees, where is that? It doesn't matter to God whether the people follow rules or whether they don't follow the rules, but he's looking on the heart to see whose heart is towards him. So when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees or the Sadducees, or when he's visiting the Samaritans, you get a little bit further background about the people that he's talking to, those that he's interfacing with. The Pharisees are the salt of the earth, middle class, very religious group of people. The Sadducees, on the other hand, are the aristocracy, the rich, the ones who don't mind rubbing elbows with the Romans and embrace Greek thought, Greek dress, and Greek mannerisms. And then, of course, we have the Samaritans that are a little bit of a mixed race, a little bit of mixed beliefs, but God has not forgotten about them. And he always remembers those whose heart is pure towards him. So I hope you've enjoyed this second video. Just a brief little glimpse into the cast of characters in the New Testament. There's many other people in there too that we could talk about, but at some later date. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Our next video will be on how can we approach the Bible and some tips and tricks to making your Bible study even more enriching, even of greater understanding, and how can you take those things and apply them to your life. Thanks for joining me. See you in the next video. Blessings.